We're going to go back to looking at Tkinter and creating GUI applications. Now, in the last couple videos we had on this, we created some labels and we created a canvas, but we didn't have any way to interact with that GUI. So what we're going to do now is learn some ways to get some interaction going. And this is one of the things with writing a graphical user interface, is that you have a few things you have to accomplish. One is you have to set it up so that it looks nice and you get the way you get to look the way you want. But then the other thing is, once you have all that stuff set up and you've placed the various widgets the way you want to, whether it be a label, which we looked at, or a canvas, you then have to set up some methods for that interface to interact with the user. So that's what we're going to concentrate on in this case. Now, having said that, I think that I've made the case that when you're creating a GUI, that you really should be creating a class for that GUI, because you not only have the creation of the interface or the look of the interface, but then you also have to have methods for that interface that determine how the user interacts with the interface. All right, so we're going to take a look here at an example. And just to review, the first thing we do is we're going to import Tkinter. And then when we do that, we're going to make a root window. We're going to instantiate a student ID GUI, whatever that is. We haven't looked at that yet. And now we're just going to do root.mainLoop. Now remember that if we just get rid of this and we just do root equals tk and the main loop, then when we run this, we just get a simple window that has nothing in it. So all the work here is done in instantiating this window up here. So let's take a look at this. And this just has an init clause. Okay, so we see some new things here. First of all, there are built-in special kinds of string variables, special to Tkinter, and it's a string, but it acts a little bit differently than a normal Python string. So we'll see one way we can use that here. We're going to create a label, so we've seen how to do that before, and this label is just going to say student ID. So we're going to create a little box that allows us to input a student ID. So this is new. We're going to be able to type some stuff in. And that's going to be in the first row, first column. So we're using the grid geometry manager, like we always do, again. Okay, then we're going to create something new. So we haven't seen this before. We're going to create an entry box. And this entry box is going to be in the root window, just like the label was. And this is going to have associated with it a text variable, self.id. And what that means is that when we enter something in, then that is going to go into self.id, which is again a special string variable. So we have to use this string variable, tk string variable, so that we can associate it with things like an entry. So whatever we type into this entry box will automatically go into self.id. We're going to set the focus on the entry, which means that when this window pops up, the cursor is going to be inside this data entry thing. This is going to go in the first row and the second column. And then we're going to create a label, another label, but in this case, the label is going to depend on a variable, and it's going to be the self.id variable. Now this is going to be interesting because this label is going to automatically update. If any changes are made to self.id, then we'll automatically see that in the screen. This is actually can be very useful for debugging your code and printing out variables, these kinds of labels. And that's going to be in the second row. Okay, so let's run this and see what it looks like. So we'll run entry boxes. And so what we have is we have our label. That's this label right here. And it's in the root window. So this whole thing is our root window. This has two rows. And then this is the entry box. This is entry right here. TK entry is this box. And if I type something into this, then I'm going to change self.id. And when I change that self.id, then this will change. And you know what I didn't do is I didn't initialize this up here, and I should have, but that's okay. It seems to have worked. So right now, self.id is an empty string. But if I type in an A, then suddenly we see this label down here changes. So any changes I make up here to A is going to change this label down here, and it's just going to echo exactly whatever I type up here. So I can type in all kinds of things. This is not a valid ID, but I'm not doing any checking for IDs. All I'm doing is inputting something into this ID string variable, and then label automatically takes care of printing out that self.id down here for me. So the thing is, I have this entry box that allows me to type something in, but I'm not really doing anything with it. I'm printing it back out, but that seems rather uninteresting since it's right there. So maybe what I want to do is check to see, do I have a valid ID? Okay, well this program as it's written is not going to allow me to do that, but I do want to just make note again of this idea that we have labels that we can create. Those labels can be static. You can just print something out into your GUI. You have entry boxes where you can type things in. Those entry boxes have to be associated with a variable. And then, oh, and remember, I guess I didn't point this out, but when we started this window up, let's run it again. Where's the cursor? The cursor is on this entry. That was the focus set. And then again, we can associate a variable with a label if we want to. Okay, but other than that, this doesn't really do too much. I can type stuff in, but then what? Okay, so now here's where things get interesting or maybe complicated. What I want to do is be able to type something in and check to see if it's a valid ID. Now, the question is, how do I know when I have typed something in? And when I say how do I know, I don't mean me personally. I mean, how does my program know? So here's the interesting thing. You can, as you're typing things in, as the programmer, check all kinds of things. For instance, I could type something in and then left click. So I'm left clicking on this right now, but you don't see anything happening. Right click. The reason why nothing's happening, even though I'm clicking all over the place on this thing, maybe you can hear my keyboard as I click, is because when I left click over here, or right click, then the guys that designed PyCharm that programmed this window programmed an action that says, oh, if they right click, put up this menu. Well, in this Tkinter window, we haven't programmed any of that. So I can left click, right click. I'm going to hit enter on the keyboard. Nothing happens. I can type, I can do all kinds of clicking and entering anything I want. Nothing happens. And the reason why nothing is happening is I haven't told my program what to do in the case of somebody right clicking or hitting enter. All right, so the way you do that, the way you create these actions is you create something called a bind. So this is very similar to the previous program. We have the root, we have this class student ID, we have a main loop, but now class student ID has some more stuff in it. So now we have some methods. And those methods basically say what happens when the user has an action. So in this case, most of this is the same. I did define now the root window. I am making that an attribute for the class, and we'll see why in a minute. I still have the same string variable for ID. This is the same label. This is the same entry box. And its position the same, but there is a difference. And the difference right here is in there's a bind command. And I'm binding to entry. And what I'm binding is if somebody hits return, so this says if somebody hits return, and you can have different letters in here. You could have control characters. I could have a button click in here if somebody clicked left. If that happens, then I'm going to call the validate method. So if somebody hits enter, I'm going to validate that they have the right kind of student ID. Now, notice that this validate does not have parentheses on the end of it. That is important. It's important because if you put parentheses on like that, that validate command will be called as soon as the window is created. And that's not what we want to have happen. We want this called when somebody hits return. So no parentheses, very important that. And then this is just the label again with the ID down at the bottom. Probably could have taken it out, but we'll just leave that there. Now, what happens with the validate? So at this point, notice that self.id is associated with this variable. So we have something in self.id and we want to check, do we have the right thing? Now, self.id is a Tkinter string variable, not a string variable. They're different. So to get an actual string out of it, we have to use a get method on that string. So we get the string out of self.id, and we'll just call that student ID, STID. And then we're going to do our checks, see if the first thing is an A or not, check the length to see if it's 8. And if neither of those are true, then we're going to call invalid ID and return. We're going to check to see if we can convert these to an int. If not, then those will create some exceptions. In the case, we'll call invalid ID and return. And if all this stuff works out just fine, then we've made it through the try. We go to the else, and we're going to call valid ID. So here's the thing. Creating these GUIs is a lot of work. You have to keep track of everything. It's not just a matter of somebody typing something in. If somebody types something in, you have to say, well, in the case that they type this, what do I do? In the case they hit enter, what do I do? Well, I have to go check to see if it's a valid ID. Now, if it's an invalid ID, what am I going to do about it? Well, I want to print out an error of some kind. The easiest way to do that, I suppose I could have used this label and said something about in a label you have an invalid ID, but what I chose to do is there's a real simple method called Messagebox show error, and you just call this Messagebox show error, type in what you want to say. This will be a title for the box. This will print out a little message, and then in this case I'm going to clear out, in the case that they've typed in an invalid ID, I'm going to put I'm going to make the entry box blank. So I'm going to delete everything in it from 0 to the end. Okay. If it's a valid ID, I'm also going to print out a message box. So this message box is a built-in Tkinter window that makes it easy to show things. The difference is I don't want it to be an error. I want it to be an info and say, hey, thank you for inputting a valid ID. And in this case, we're done. We're not going to do anything else with that ID. So I am just going to destroy the entire window. Okay, so let's run it again. And I'm typing. Nothing's happening. I right click, nothing happened. Left click, nothing happens because I haven't told Tkinter what to do in the case that the user right clicks or left clicks. I could put a bind down here for those things, but I haven't. But if I hit enter, that bind then will take us down to the validate. Oops, put my cursor back up here in the entry box. And I'll hit enter. And I am running the wrong thing. I'm running entry boxes. Let's try doing this again. I couldn't figure out why this wasn't working. Let's run bind. And we'll try that again. And I'll hit enter, which will call validate, right? And in validate, it's going to say, wow, you've got way too much stuff. That's invalid. And invalid then creates this message box. The show error message box puts a big X there. And then it prints out see invalid student ID. That's the title for this box. And then this is the little message. Student IDs must have the form A and a bunch of X's where X is a digit. Okay. And we can close that out. When I close that out, then I delete all the stuff that I typed in here. And we come back to where all this is running in this main loop here. So we're still just running along here with this window until we close the window. All right, so let's try it again. This time I'll type in a valid ID. You have to have 7 digits. All right, so I'll type that in, and now in this case, validate's going to say, oh, yep, you got something valid. It's going to go up here to valid ID, and it's going to first create a window that says, hey, thanks for the ID number. You got it right. And then when I click OK here, that's going to close this window. And then the next thing it's going to execute is we are going to destroy the root window, so that's going to close that too. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff here to think about. And the part of the problem with teaching this Tkinter and GUI stuff is that it's hard to say where the focus is. What I want the focus is to be on the bind. You control the actions of the GUI, so you have to program. If you want something to happen when somebody hits the return character, you have to program it. If you want something to happen when somebody right clicks, you control that. You have to program it by creating some kind of bind or something and then creating a procedure to say this is what you got to do. Okay? Now, you don't have to bind to just entry boxes, so we're going to come over here and look at a canvas. All right, so this is kind of a big looking program, kind of scary looking, isn't it? All right, well, let's see what we have. We have a root window, that's good. We have this canvas, apparently, or at least we have some kind of class canvas that we're passing in the root, and then we're gonna call a main loop. Oh, you know what? I forgot something back here I wanted to say. Remember when I said I put root here as an attribute for the class? The reason for that is down here in the valid ID, I wanted to close it, and so because it's an attribute, I can just call that destroy method. Okay, back to here. All right, so what do we have? This actually is essentially the same piece of code that we had in our previous use of Canvas, with a few additions. We have a couple of string variables, x and y. We're going to create a canvas that's 200 by 400. That actually should look familiar. This is what we did before. Background's floral white. We're going to have 3 columns. And then we're going to create a rectangle that starts at 10 and goes to 80. So this is 70 by 70. Exactly the same thing we did before. It's going to be a pale goldenrod. This is going to be 70 by 70, and right next to this one, a dark goldenrod. And then we're going to create a text that we're going to put inside the first rectangle that says click here. And we're going to give this a tag called left. The tag is not going to be printed out, but internally we can use that tag if some kind of action happens with clicking. Okay, we're going to create another one, text, that says click here. This is going to be the right one. Now this one's going to start off as hidden, so this actually isn't going to print out when we first open up the window. And then we're going to bind to the canvas a button click. So this is a left button click. And if somebody clicks the left button, we're going to call self.click. Okay, so this is one of our class methods. And again, this is why GUIs are often created as classes, because you instantiate some information, but then you create methods to say, how do I deal with different kinds of things that can happen here? Okay. At the bottom of this window, we are going to create a label, and that label is going to show us the position of our cursor. We're actually going to have 3 labels. So the first one is just going to say position. That's going to be in row 1. That's why I put the column span of 3 up here. We're going to have 3 different columns. So this is actually, sorry, this is going to be the second row. The canvas is in the first row. And the 3 columns are, we're going to print off, the label is going to have the X and Y positions. Now, we'll talk about what those X and Y positions are in a minute. What is self.x and self.y? Well, initially, you don't have anything in them. Okay, so when we click with the left button, self.click is going to be called. And this has 2 arguments that we pass in. So anytime you create a method like this to handle a button click, then you should have an event variable. And the event has some information in it. In this case, event has the X and Y position of where the click happened. So we're going to set then our string variables to have the value of the X and Y position where the mouse was clicked. And then we're going to check. We're going to check to see if it was in the first rectangle or the second rectangle. If we click in the first rectangle, then we're going to make that left click here tag, so notice this was tagged to the left, we're going to set that equal to hidden. So we're going to hide it. So this is a new thing. We have canvas, and we can configure things in the canvas dynamically using item config. And the thing that we're going to configure is the thing that was tagged as left, and we're going to hide that. And the thing that was right, we're going to set to a normal state. And if we click in the right inside the right rectangle, we're going to do the opposite. We are going to open up the thing that says, we're going to open up the left text, and we're going to hide the right text. Okay, you know what? It might be time to run this thing to see how all of this works. So we're going to run bind to canvas. Okay, so this should look somewhat familiar. This looks a lot like the canvas we created in the earlier version of showing you how to create a canvas. So here's our two rectangles with that pretty, what color is it? Floral white background. Notice that now down below here we do have that label position, which is going to show us X and Y. And so I can click anywhere inside the canvas. I can click down here and nothing happens. I'm left clicking. You can't see me do that, but I am left clicking. Maybe you can hear it. And nothing happens. The reason why is I have a bind up here for the left button, but that bind is to the canvas. So if I'm outside the canvas, nothing happens. Now if I'm inside the canvas and I click, then we go down to click here, and it sets self.x and self.y to the X and Y position. Those are tied to those two labels, which automatically print those two things out, self.x and self.y. And so we see then this is our mouse position. And this was a 400 by 200 canvas. So down there in the corner, oops, well, we shouldn't have a value of 401 in a 400 by 200 canvas, but apparently you can. Okay, so I can click anywhere in here. What happens if I click in this box? Well, if I click in this box, then my X value is 39, my Y value is 48, and in that case, I'm right here. X value is in between 10 and 80, Y value is in between 10 and 80, so I hide the thing that said click here on the left, right? That was tagged as left, and I unhide the thing that was tagged on the right. That's right here. If I click here again, I keep doing the same thing. It's just going to keep unhiding this and hiding the click here, so it doesn't look like anything new is happening. If I could click really fast, I might be able to get this thing to flicker, but probably not. But if I click over here, well, nothing happens down here either. But if I click here, now X value is 108, Y value is 43. That puts us in this case. X is in between 80 and 150, Y is in between 10 and 80. And so we switch and we unhide the left and we hide the right. Ooh, again, lots of information in here. So some more information. Again, we can bind any action we want. So we can bind mouse clicks, we can bind characters. If I typed in a C, I could make this thing do weird things if I typed in a letter C. With mouse clicks, you get a position. You get an X and a Y. So on the event here, we get an X and a Y on that event. There's tags. Those tags can be used as names down here, which makes this very handy to change the state of things using those tags. So my encouragement to you would be to look over this code. It's up on GitHub. Maybe download it. You can play around with it. You can change the size of the rectangles. You could change this to button 2 and see what happens there. Go ahead and click away and see what you can do with it.